Welcome everybody to today's virtual digital economy seminar. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you and continue the series with another fantastic speaker. Our moderator for today will be Reinhold Kessler at the University of Zurich, and he will introduce our guest momentarily. I guess you have an idea who he is, but Reinhold will take it from there. The rules are as always, if you have any clarifying questions throughout the talk, please send them to Reinhold in the chat window. He will then unmute you so you can ask your question directly. And if you prefer, you can of course also ask Reinhold to ask the question for you. We will collect questions for the Q&A after the talk in the same way. So don't hesitate to send the questions to Reinhold in the chat. As always, this session will be recorded and made available on YouTube. So if you do ask a question, you will appear in the recording. All right, so I'm happy to hand over to Reinhold.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm very excited to have Shane Greenstein here with us today. Shane is a professor at the Harvard Business School and also the co-director of the program on the economics of digitization at the NBR. So presumably all of you have come across his research on various aspects of the digital economy. And one particular thing that I admire about Shane's work is that it also covers the infrastructure of the internet with papers on the net neutrality and interconnection agreements that we all kind of take for granted. And so I'm very much looking forward to today's talk on data centers, which is also one key component of today's web. And so Shane, thanks for coming, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. This is joint work with Tommy Pan-Fang, who is also on the call, I believe. And you know, we're happy to answer questions at the end. Again, thank you. And like I say, we'll leave questions to the end, but I'll pause it a couple moments for quick questions too. So that's planned. I'll do it in the outline. So here's how the plan for the talk, and certainly as we move between sections, I'll certainly pause. So the research question is sort of broad. What are the economic determinants of data center locations in the US? And you know, your basic economic intuition is data moves at the speed of light. So the vast majority of US data centers ought to end up in favorable conditions. And what are those going to be? Cheap land, inexpensive electricity, cool environment. So the air conditioning requirements are rather low. And that's just wrong, as it turns out. Okay, and that's kind of the core puzzle of the paper, and it's why it's so much fun. And I'll just hint at it already right away, and then we'll get into detail. This is a map we're going to show you. We'll tell you later how we put it together of all the data centers in the United States. Just look at this one place here. This is Prineville, Oregon. Okay, it has a population of 10,000 people. It's in the eastern part of Oregon, which, in case you've never been there, is on the other side of the mountains and is this vast plain of not very much in the way, it's mostly ranch land. Okay, so what is there? That's what you'll find there. 8 data centers, all operated by Facebook. They're about to open a 9th one now, by the way. Each one of those, the most recent data center they're about to open is about $2 billion investment. So what should be obvious from this? One thing should be obvious, that is Prineville is just one of many places with a data center. We'll explain that in a moment. What should also be obvious is that the Pacific Northwest is not the home to most of the data centers in the US, despite having all those low air conditioning requirements, cheap electricity, and abundant land. So the research question here could be rephrased as, despite seemingly favorable conditions, why doesn't the Pacific Northwest serve as the home to all the data centers in the United States? And I would say the European equivalent, by the way, for this would be, how come they're not all in Norway, which is the geographic equivalent? And what's wrong with your intuition is that you have to use both supply and demand. It's not, this intuition is about supply, and we have to think about demand. And so what we want you to walk away with is the more subtle question: does the distaste for distance shape the localization of US data centers? And if so, how does it shape those decisions? Okay, now what is distaste for distance? It's a buyer preference for services that are nearby. we'll get into that in a moment. So now, why would you care about this? Well, there's a couple things. First, fundamentally, this is about the economics and strategy of proximity and the role distance plays in digital markets. We're going to have a lot to say about that. Second, as was hinted by Reinhold, data centers are overlooked. Even though at least in the United States, there are a couple $100 billion of assets, and they're central to the internet supply chain. As far as we can find out, there's not a single academic study about them. And so we were curious. As it turns out, related to that, they're undocumented. So nobody even knew to ask the question about location until we collected the data. It turns out it'll be this will cite about the urban bias of growth in urban technology, in digital technology. And it will address a question that's arising a lot in popular discussion, that perhaps the data center industry will jumpstart the rural economy, as the Facebook example I started with. And it's going to phrase a set of questions about maybe where we're going as an economy, because there's an interesting tension between the way the data center industry worked, and we'll document and we'll show you, and where the cloud services are going. There's also quite a lot of policy at risk here. There's many subsidies that go into data centers and to attract them to locations. And there's quite a bit of regulation in the works about them, particularly if you read the GDPR carefully. There's a lot of provisions about where data is stored and where they can be. So location matters quite a bit. Okay, so what we're going to do is take a census of all the third-party data centers in the United States just from a year ago. We'll assign them to a location. We'll collect a lot of information about them. We'll show you a lot of novel statistics about their location, which nobody knew until we did this. Or let me say, the industry knows it intuitively. You can talk to people in the industry and they're not surprised by what we're getting, but it was not well documented. And we'll analyze the determinants of this location. Though we cannot directly observe distaste for distance, we will assume a model of distaste for distance and look for implications consistent with that model. And then we will find many things consistent with that model. So that's what we're going to do. And so here's what we're going to find. We're going to find lots of evidence of this distaste for distance. We'll see a threshold model of entry determined by economies of scale, where the economies of scale are in tension against localization of demand. I'll explain that more when we get to it. We'll see that the cost of supply plays a role. Occasionally, that's a very important role, as your intuition would tell you, but often it's a secondary role to demand. So the sorts of things that will come up were the temperatures, the network engineer wages, the tax breaks, and the land values. And we will get findings that are consistent with an urban bias to technology. It will tend to agglomerate primarily in urban areas. And our results suggest that the popular myths are rather wrong or are at variance with what you see in a grounded way. Most of the data centers in the US do not show up in the Pacific Northwest. There is an interesting tension, which we're going to leave you with, which is that the cloud industry, which is growing now, perhaps behaves differently. And so that will be an interesting puzzle we'll be left with. Okay, and it's robust to many things, which I don't think we'll have time for today. Okay, so our contributions are, we're the first to do this. I would say more broadly, there is this more broad literature on the supply chain of the internet. It's primarily focused on studies of access. And that's because that's where a lot of public policy is focused. But many other parts of the supply chain are neglected, and the internet's big enough that we shouldn't do that. There's actually many interesting puzzles behind the scenes. And I actually try to encourage others to just look under a rock. You know, just what do you find there? There are all kinds of interesting things that you didn't know. We're going to contribute to the literature on urban bias of digital technology, as I said, and we're going to put forward a different mechanism for the geographic properties of digital infrastructure. Particularly, we're going to place this emphasis on localization and demand. There are lots of other mechanisms at work. Okay, that's a good time to pause. That's the overview of where we're going. So quick questions, and then I'll get into setting and background and set things up.
So far, there aren't any questions, so everything seems to be clear.
Great. Okay. Yeah, that's probably not the case, but we'll keep going, and feel free to ask. So let's give you some background. I imagine most of you have never been into a data center. I feel like asking and getting a poll, but I'll assume most of you haven't been. Here's a picture of a data center. I always describe data centers as a very large building with a very small parking lot. That's because they just don't employ very many people relative to their size, and they tend to be a single story. And even this is a great example of one where when you vary from the single story, it's usually because the air conditioning is sitting on the top and then is being spread throughout the building. So this is one in Ashburn, Virginia. Here's another one in a rural location. That's in Maize, Oklahoma. Here's another example. This is Google's data center in Charleston, South Carolina. And here's a data center in San Francisco, California. And I say that because that's unbelievable. There we have a data center. It's actually multi-story, which is unusual for data centers. And it's in the most expensive real estate in the United States. And we'll come back to this, yeah, in fact, you find data centers in very expensive land. Okay, so what do they look like on the inside? Well, they repetitious lines of servers. This is the future of the digital world. And they often are parodied, if you know the Silicon Valley, the particular comedy on HBO. They made fun of one of the data centers as well. Oh, there's our future. Okay, so just a brief bit of history, not a lot, but let me give you a little bit just to give you some feeling for what's going on here. The earliest data centers start to show up in the 1990s. They, in the way that we're going to talk about them. They even have a history that goes back further, but let's start with the 1990s. The primary demands at that point were to get better air conditioning, more efficient electricity use, to reduce vibration from traffic and other kinds of outside things, get backup generators. They were mostly private at the beginning. They were mostly oriented towards storage. Then a third-party industry grew during the dot-com boom in the late 90s to try to address the biggest needs out there, particularly for backup. And I would say for an economist, the contracting is fascinating. We're not going to talk much about that today, but every conceivable contract you could think of actually shows up here. There's everything. There's build to own, build to rent some parts, build to own other parts. It's just a massive variety. And today, over time, it varied into renting more and more. And in many respects, the cloud, as we know it today, is just renting data centers with instant on and off, and perhaps a little bit of layer of free services. And actually, where most of the growth is going today is in the layer of free services. Just to give you a sense of the timing here, the New York Stock Exchange moved to a data center in New Jersey in 2010. So in case you didn't know, if you go to Wall Street today, there is no trading on Wall Street. It's across the river in New Jersey. The data set, some of the first data centers from the private firms show up earlier than that. It's Google's first data centers in 2003, and then it grows from there. And the cloud is a very recent phenomenon relative to the size of the data center industry. Though AWS begins in 2006, it's only $8 billion in 2015, which is, by the way, trivial compared to the size of the private data center market. And more recently, it's $35 billion and last year. And that's starting to tell you that it's getting big enough to really make a dent in where data centers are going. Okay. let me give you a feel for what we're going to see. We're going to mostly do general statistics, but I want to give you a sense of what's going on. The paper talks about this at more length. There are three things going on in demand for distance. The first one is concerns about latency. So if you're a high-end programmer or you're in the finance industry where a second makes a difference, or you're a high-end programmer and you're very impatient, you want your data and computing to be very close by. You know, that isn't a huge part of this market, but there are a lot of people who act like it nonetheless. You wouldn't think it was big, but it turns out to be big. A second thing you might worry about is congestion. So data centers don't operate by themselves. They have to connect to lines. They have to interconnect in order to get to the place where you're doing your computing. As many of you know from remote work, there's a lot of lines between your home and your office or somebody else's office. And somewhere along those lines, you can have congestion that can affect what you can do. Now, just imagine you're using 7 terabytes of data every day. That congestion can have a huge consequence on what you're able to do. And so congestion, as it turns out, to be another concern that many users have and want their data to be closer. There's a third thing going on. We didn't know this till we interviewed people in the industry. I'm using industry term here. They call them server huggers. That's very graphic, right? It's like hugging your server. And primarily this is managerial concerns about safety and security. In the event of emergency, the manager who is in charge of the data center wants to be able to go there immediately. And so you might think of that as having the data center within an hour's drive. All the three of these things will generate demand for local provision. Nonetheless, the interesting thing is everything's provided, or every potential supply is out there. So that doesn't tell you what the equilibrium is, and we didn't know before we collected data. Some more background just to give you a sense of the economics here. A small data center, and I mean small, okay, about as small as you can get, has a construction cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 to $300 million. The latter is sort of what you would get in Manhattan or San Francisco. The high end of these, like the Facebook ones, those are more on the order of $1 to $2 billion. Big determinants, people in the industry will tell you this. You can surf the internet in a couple hours. You'd learn this yourself. Big things that matter are, land prices, sales tax, property taxes, construction wages, electricity, special air cooling. Depending on what you're putting up, you might have some special features for backup. That's just the setup costs. And there's the operating costs. Again, very small, tiny data centers. That's about as low as you can get. We're looking at something like $10 million a year, okay, in operating costs. And that can vary quite a bit. In the largest ones, 10 times that is not unusual at all, over $100 million operating costs per year. Things that affect operating costs would be things like temperature. So extreme hots and extreme colds. So extreme colds, you need to heat it up a little bit. Extreme hots, you need to cool, especially. And other things like sales tax that affect your ability to put in new equipment, and other sorts of things like electricity prices in particular, since electricity is the primary input here. You might reasonably worry about the wages for technical employment. We're going to test for that. Largely, we don't find that that's going to matter, but it's basically because most of these do not employ a large number of people. They have to get a certain number of technical people, and then, but not in huge numbers. Okay, that's a good place to pause again.
Yeah, very good. There's also a question on the data centers, and I'm going to unmute Sebastian. Should be unmuted, Sebastian.
Yeah. Hi, Shane. Hi, everyone. Sorry for running while I was watching this. Shane, this is really cool work. My first question is about, there were a lot of trucks in front of the data centers. What is being delivered? And then the more important question, I guess, is you talk about distaste for distance. Is this distaste of consumers or the data centers planners? And how do we distinguish between distaste for distance and just customers' familiarity with the region's name as they browse through the list of data centers?
Yeah, great questions. We'll defer parts of the second one, but I'll give you an intuition. So the first one, what are the trucks doing? I don't know in particular, but I would guess serving equipment. So many of these places, particularly once they're up and running after a couple of years, have hundreds of thousands of servers and have a constant demand for replacement. I mean, the actual management of moving burnt servers out, moving new servers in, upgrading the entire place so that it continues to be on the frontier. That's actually an ongoing activity. There are people whose sole job is to do that and monitor that and so on. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was equipment. So that's the easy answer. The more challenging answer, and let's just put it up there, it's supply and demand. So we're going to assert demand. We're going to assert demand from users. We're going to also assert that there's got to be a variety out there. Some have very intense demands for something that's local. Some have less intense demands. And it's very hard to observe that. On the supply side, there are also going to be things that will affect location. Things like, can you hire the technical talent you need? If you move 15 miles in one direction, do you get cheaper electricity? Is the land cheaper if you move outside the major city? Those kinds of considerations also matter. Mm-hmm. You can see where we're going to go with this. You have supply. We can measure some of those determinants, prices for electricity, prices of land, the availability of tax abatement. And on demand, we can measure some of those as well. Is there an IT-intensive industry nearby that we know tends to be a heavy demander of these kinds of services? Do we find the kinds of things in the location that we would think would increase demand or lower demand? So that's the direction we're actually going there. We're going to go through, try to measure these determinants.
Gotcha.
And I'll give you more detail in a minute. So.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder if you could also learn more by just maybe asking some of the planners that think about locating these.
Oh yeah, it's a sort of really fascinating question. It's a lot of tension in the industry today in trying to be both close to the user. They know that it affects their sales, so they're aware of it. It also affects their costs, so they are making strategic choices about where to go. And it's a technical question. There's actually in the computer science community a lot of work today on what's known as distributed architectures. That is setting these systems up in such a way as to move servers, disperse servers geographically so that they're closer to the user community, even though you might have a centralization of computing in one place, like, for example, Facebook does in order to do its newsfeed. And so you give the appearance to the user that things are local, even though they're not. And if there are technical ways you can achieve that, that's actually a big place for a lot of investment today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super cool stuff. This data is awesome. Thanks, Shane.
Yeah, no, pleasure. How's that? Ready to go?
Very good. There is another small question by Neil Thompson. Maybe you can also answer that one. Neil, you should be unmuted. So I don't know whether it's only needed. Maybe I just asked the question. So what is the mix of the customers? So for example, Netflix versus small users.
We don't really know. We'll show you that we're presuming a mix across a number of industries, although we believe most of it's coming from finance and other data intensive industries like software intensive activities. So we don't really know. I'm not sure anybody knows, actually. It's a great question. Okay,
Okay.
Keep going. Okay, I have a model. I think in light of time, I won't spend much time on this. We're just using the Bresnan and Rees model. I'm assuming most people are familiar with it. You know, there's a fixed cost to entering a market. There's a variable profit function that is steeper as you get more entrants. And what that should create is a mapping between the size of the market in terms of number of customers, and if they were all alike, and the number of entrants you would see. It would also take different forms depending on the intensity of demand coming from the customers. That's the economics we're using. It's not novel, I would say, and that's in some sense a point. Our point is this is not novel, and it's a mechanism that's creating urban demand. It also creates things you should be able to observe. You should observe a threshold model. So you should expect that threshold to be a function of the size of the market. You should expect it to move in certain directions based on whether supply and demand are pushing it upwards or downwards. Your intuition for this is not particularly complicated. The most complicated parts about this have to do with US geography. I'll just say population levels and density are heavily correlated. To say that in words, the places with the highest population have the highest density. And so you can use either one as a statistical matter as a substitute for the other. And that complicates the model a little bit, but it doesn't complicate the economics. The economics themselves are rather straightforward. And the core question is, what do you need in order to support another entrant? More customers, lower costs, how do those trade off? And it's a fairly straightforward model to test for that. So our aspirations are going to be the following. We're going to do this in a reduced formed way using just threshold models, standard threshold models like logits and ordered logits. And we're going to compare different kinds of entrants, the urban, what we'll call urban, suburban, and footloose. So an urban will be somebody who's deliberately trying to serve customers in a downtown area. A suburban will be someone who's within a few miles of the downtown area, within 30 miles, I'll give you definitions in a moment, of a downtown area. And footloose is someone who doesn't care, who's willing to locate anywhere and take customer from anywhere. We'll ask, do they behave differently? And do they behave in ways that are consistent with this threshold model? We'll try to sharpen those estimates about costs and the role of cost by using the Bresnan and Rees model in a very direct way. And we'll also look for demand for capacity. If I have time, this is the part that I'm not sure I'm gonna have time for. And it's using a Heckman correction. It's a fairly straightforward, again, very straightforward econometrics. Okay, there's a good time to pause. And now it's data from here on out.
No questions yet.
Awesome. Okay, here's some data. Let's have some fun. This is what we were interested in. We didn't know what we were going to get. As Tommy will tell you, it took a bit of work to figure this out. Like every industry, that turns out the data center industry documents itself for consulting. And so we went and found this out. And at the time when we looked, there were 1,700 third-party data centers, 1,300 of which were in the US. We started to classify them. If they're within 5 kilometers of a city center, we call them urban. That turns out to be 564 of the ones we found. If they're within 5 to 30 kilometers, we call them suburban. And the ones who are outside of 30 kilometers, we'll call them footloose. And we have a hypothesis that their behavior is consistent with the supply and demand determinants that we put forward. You know, if the model doesn't work, then we reject the hypothesis. If the model works, then we find things consistent with it. As it turns out, if you look look further, we look around US counties. Despite there being more than 3,000 counties in the US, we only include 1,100 of them, just under 1,200. And the primary reason is most rural counties in the US just don't have any data centers, and they're nowhere near having any data centers, and it's obvious they don't have any, and it's pointless to put that data in the model, and so we're going to focus on the counties that are what are called MSAs, that is to say metropolitan and micropolitan areas. So and you should see, this is a conclusion. The idea that US data centers are showing up in the middle of the rural areas is just not consistent with what we're going to find. You'll see this. Third parties, in particular, third-party data centers, not at all. Some of the private ones potentially. So this is a map. I showed you this map at the beginning. This is what we're going to find. We're going to classify the data centers into 4 categories. As I said, urban, suburban, and footloose. And because there's a lot of interest in it, we have this 4th category, private. Private are Facebook, Google, Amazon. These are the data centers used by the largest internet firms. These, despite being private, they're the worst kept secret on the internet. You can find out where they are. It's not particularly hard to do that. And the first thing that should hit you right away when you look at this map is they're all over the place. And the second thing is, if you know US geography, they're located in most of the major cities. But that's probably hard for many of you to do. So then we're going to do a little more statistics just to push that up. And let me give you a good way to think about it. Here's just a simple, before we do the complicated econometrics, here's just a simple graph of the number of entrants and the log of the population on the x-axis. And what do you see from this? You just don't see any entry below what's 12, which in this case is a county of 160,000 people. And any county above 700,000, you definitely see a lot of entry. And then between those 2 population levels, as you can see, you get a variety. Let's focus for a moment on everyone always wants to know who's got the most. So that's the purple box there. And there's no surprise who has the most. Santa Clara County in California is Silicon Valley. So in other words, that's where the industry is located. Los Angeles is next. Dallas is next. Cook County is Chicago, Illinois. So there you have some of the largest cities in the country. New York is number 5. So none of this should surprise you. Maricopa is Phoenix. Fulton County is Atlanta. By the way, Maricopa should also tell you something's funny going on. Phoenix, Arizona is one of the hottest places in the United States. Why in the world are there data centers in a location that is one of the hottest places in the US? Why? Well, there's cheap electricity because of the Hoover Dam, and there's a lot of people there. And actually, then there's the kind of industry there that wants data centers to be nearby. And so despite what seems to be an inefficient location, you find it there. We'll just keep going on. Just on this simple, this looks like a threshold model. This is kind of what you would expect. I mean, there's more going on because of intensity demand, and we'll do that. But this is sort of what you expect. We can break this down by type of market, and we'll spend a bit of time in our econometrics with this. Anybody who knows entry models, you kind of look at the difference between the places where you get no entrants and 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 entrants. And as you see, we have quite a variety among our counties, and that's great for our statistics. But it's also telling you that there are really only 218 counties out of all the metropolitan, micropolitan counties in the US that have any entry at all. Okay, so just so you understand again, it's a pretty concentrated activity already. This is all just basic descriptive statistics start to tell you what's going on. And it just tells you that it's concentrated in a few locations. Most don't have anything. This is not a rural phenomenon for the most part. And it sure looks like it's population playing a big role. This is just some details about our design of urban, suburban, and footloose. For the sake of time, I'll skip it. Let me show you some of the other descriptive things, and then we'll get into detail. So here's just a simple plot of the log of population over the capacity. And again, that should tell you, it looks pretty simple. You might have asked about that location that seems to have a lot of capacity. That's Ashburn, Virginia. That's just outside of Dulles Airport, by the way, just west of Washington, D.C. And it is the largest collection of data centers capacity in the United States. It's also one of the oldest data exchange points in the United States internet. So it's there for a reason. It has some of the best internet traffic in the East Coast. Some other things to notice: where do you have the most capacity? Well, as it turns out, it's the same list that I gave you just a couple slides ago. You know, Dallas, Santa Clara, Cook County, again, Chicago, Los Angeles, again, Phoenix, and so on. Okay. And it's got the shape you would expect. Now, lastly, look at that circle. That's the private data centers. A sort of very interesting feature about the private data centers is they disproportionately locate in places with less population. And we'll come back to this repeatedly. What's very interesting about the private data center world, that is the Facebook, Google, Amazon, that's what you should think of when you see that, is that they tend to be locating differently than the third-party industry. And that's an interesting change in tension going forward. Okay, a couple other pieces of economics. Sometimes you might want to look at the largest data center in a location, and that's of interest because you'd like to know whether land is, since they tend to be one story almost everywhere except the densest urban locations, you would think that the largest one you see tells you about whether there's a limiting factor, that land is a limiting factor. And so one of the interesting comparisons you would do is to take the size of the largest, and it is increasing in population. You'd also compare the privates with the third party. And what's interesting there is that the size of the data centers, the largest data centers, tends to be the same for both categories. And that's what that's telling you is land does not tend to be the limiting factor for the size of the data centers for third-party providers, even in the most urban environments. And that's interesting. We didn't know this before we did these statistics. You might do the same thing for the smallest one you'd find. The smallest viable center is telling you something about the economics of margins inside of and specialization. And boy, does that go down in an interesting way. And really the more interesting one is you don't really find small data centers until population is big enough. That's really the core observation. And that's telling you something about the propensity to find differentiated suppliers. We actually will go and test this. And it will be true in the data as well. The core differentiated suppliers who are looking for specialized buyers disproportionately show up in the major urban areas and large population in particular. Okay, so here's the table. It's in the paper. We look at major versus minor markets and the frequency with which you find these specialists. And as I said, they're much more common in the major urban areas. And just to give you a sense of what that means, you could have a data center HIPAA. That means it's got a set of rules over security so that privacy can be protected. Right? High tech is a set of rules so that it's consistent with the health law so that health data can be protected. Then there's the SOC 1 and SOC 2. These are a set of rules to protect financial data. And you need very specific things. Oftentimes what the buyers want is a lot of a backup as well so that nothing will be lost. Okay, and so again, just to run through it real quick, the bigger markets have more specialists. Okay, now, I want to show you some econometrics. I know we're gonna run out of time here, but it's fun to see some of that. So let me pause though, just to before we get to that.
I think in the interest of time, you can go on and then we take the questions at the end. So sure. We have about 5 to 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting we would end up being a little rushed here. And that's okay. I'll just show you the basic results. So we're going to estimate a threshold model. It's pretty straightforward. You can do this a couple different ways. You know, we try everything. We'll have a bunch of demand shifters that go into it. Whether there's information industry nearby, health, education, finance, insurance, and real estate, and manufacturing. We'll look at the characteristics of the population as well. Then we'll have all the standard cost shifters. We took a lot of time for us to collect all of this: electricity prices, real estate prices, temperatures, median engineering wage, medium home values. Those are the cost shifters, and we'll even do some fixed cost shifters, sales tax. You know, I have a big list here: medium home values, whether it's tax abatement, construction wages. Okay, so that's every list we could come up with. We'll do the estimates, what predicts entry. We'll do it across different types, and that's, you know, that's what we're going to do. So we get tables like this. I know that's kind of hard to read, and it's in the paper. So if you're really interested, you can stare at these for a long time. As it turns out, if there's a lot of information industry nearby, what do you know? You get a lot of data centers. Similarly, if there's a lot of finance and insurance real estate, and if it's a high population area. That's what you would expect. We can do it on the cost determinants like tax breaks, medium home value. Those predict exactly as you would expect as well. And we can compare different types. I'm just going to run through it. Just, you know, we did what you would expect. It's not, there's nothing about this that's particularly methodologically novel. And you find differences across the different types. That's interesting. For the most part, it's consistent with what we thought we'd find. Really on the cost side, the big surprise for us was that the costs did not become as important as we thought. Certainly the industry had told us to worry about that, and we were surprised. We didn't find, we found some cost things factor in, like medium network engineering wages, but we didn't see electricity prices mattering nearly as much as what we thought. Hot and cold matters. That's what we thought, but we were a bit surprised. And so one of the things we do in the paper is we do a Bresnan and Rees model. And what we're going to do, just to give you the intuition, is we're going to assume a flexible demand form, but impose the same cost function across all firms. And that seems to, that makes sense in this industry. There are no trade secrets here. Everybody knows everybody. It doesn't matter what type you are. They all have access to the same construction firms who will do the third party, who will do building for them. It's pretty hard to keep a trade secret. So imposing the same cost function across firms is not a big deal here. And then by doing that, it allows us to identify the role of cost with a little more precision. And so here's the example of what we get now. When we do that, we get that the median network engineering wage does discourage entry. Colder places encourages entry. Hotter places discourages it. Tax breaks encourage it. High sales tax encourages it. That's not what you'd expect, but I think that's because it's standing in for a large, high density, a large amount of economic activity. High home values discourages it. And we can do these interesting simulations. This is a story we'll finish up here, where you can ask the question, well, what if you had a firm in one location and you tried to move them into another location? What do you see? What's determining the differences across different types of markets? And the key takeaway here is that there's an unseen, just to be clear in the model, an unseen effect that all firms in one location are benefiting or being hurt by. But in the measured side of these models, what we're finding is a decrease in margins in the measured parts as you move from a monopoly to a top market, and an increase in fixed costs as you move from a low density location to, again, a top market. And what that's telling you is it's very likely that all the firms in the top markets, in spite of those cost and demand conditions, are benefiting from something that has to do with simply being located in urban areas. Okay, I can show you some more, but in the event of time. Lastly, we do a capacity estimate. Again, you have to stare at this for a while to understand what we're getting. I have to say, largely, there's really only one thing we walked away with from our capacity estimate that was interesting. And the most interesting thing is not on the demand side, it's on the supply side. We see electricity prices playing having a big effect on the footloose providers in a way that we just didn't see on any other type of provider. And that is consistent with what you'd expect. But by and large, though, capacity is not sensitive. So let me give you the summary, because I know we're at time. So we see evidence of local demand. We get exactly what we thought we would get. Places with dense populations and large populations attract entry. We also see land values and weather explaining things. Footloose firms do look different than everybody else. And as a statistical matter, electricity prices affect their capacity in a way that's not true of the others. Which is telling you, by the way, that firms in urban areas are locating there in spite of the electricity prices. That's the way to think about it. The smallest markets differ substantially from the largest. And aggregate demand and total capacity is just not very easy to estimate. That's one of the last things we walk away with. So conclusion, there's an economic and strategic logic to what we observe. Proximity does matter for the location of the infrastructure. It's coming from localization of demand that's in tension with economies of scale. That's a very old economic story. And but it just hasn't gotten attention, and it's playing a big role for this part of internet infrastructure. You can track it, you can see it. That's another thing we're coming out with. It was not recognized before, and so we can recognize it. We also see this concentration in major urban areas. So I didn't show you a ton of this data, but you have to take my word for it a little bit. New York and San Francisco are doing really well here, but it's a medium-sized city, not necessarily. And then we don't see anything that looks like a panacea for the rural areas. The most interesting tension for low-density parts of the United States is that the big private data centers tend to favor those locations in a way that is not true of the third-party industry that's supporting the rest of the demand. And so going forward, that's an interesting difference that we would expect to want to follow. So that's the quick way to get through it.
Thank you very much, Shane. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Very, very interesting, and we have multiple questions already.
Oh, wonderful.
So I will start with the question by Luis Cabral. I'm going to unmute you. So.
Oh, hey, it's great to see you, Luis.
Good to see you too, Shane, and good to see you. And very fun paper, and I really liked it. And I think the Bresnahan-Rees framework makes a ton of sense. But you already partly answered my question. I mean, one fundamental difference in here is, of course, in Bresnahan-Rees, they were looking for very localized markets where clearly the demand side was causing the entry thresholds. Whereas in here, you have both demand side and supply side effects. Yeah. And I think it's, from a theory point of view, I'm the applied theorist in here, I think it's super cool to try to distinguish the importance of demand effects from the importance of supply effects in creating those thresholds. You said at the beginning that these guys are constantly changing their servers. So I'm sure there's a lot of services that they need that they're going to procure in local markets, both in terms of human capital and in terms of physical capital. And so I think a really cool question would be to try to assign how much of the allocation decisions are driven by demand factors, how much they're driven by supply factors. Your presentation suggests that you're already doing that. I'll have to read the paper, but I think that would be a really cool question to try to address. There's a lot of correlation, of course, between the two, and that's what makes it difficult to answer.
Right, that's what makes it hard. Great question. You know what also makes it hard? Bresnahan and Rees would say this too. Their model has a very difficult time identifying fixed costs from sort of variable profitability. Yeah, and you need a lot of data to do that, and you have to assume a lot to get a really clean difference, and we really don't have enough data here to do that. So, you know, truth be told, we buried a little bit of that in the estimate of the constants, and we don't really have an answer. So we actually can't answer your question, which I had hoped we might be able to answer when we started. You know, exactly what fraction are going to what part of demand and supply is a great question.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to answer. I just think it's an interesting question.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, it's also, this is also one of those situations where you could collect a lot of little data. And you know, if you had 5 years and an infinite number of undergraduates, hey, you could do it. But you know, but we had, this took us a couple of years only. So
great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks. Great question.
We have another question by Neil Thornton. This time with another microphone. Let's see.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, so as I said before, so I love the work. It's really super interesting. I was wondering if you might be able to do any sort of time slices. And so in particular, what I'm thinking here is that, you know, if you think of a lot of the way that people use cloud, they use it for pretty small things, right? Traditionally, but there's this, as deep learning has come in, people are starting to do much, much bigger, like many GPUs for like a week kind of thing. And in those cases, you might think that that sort of changes the net push between demand and supply, that when you're doing small stuff, you really care about being local because you care about the stuff. Whereas if you're dispatching something that's going to, for a couple of weeks, going to be massive, you may maybe care more about the supply side issues. And I'm wondering if you can sort of do any time cuts to look at that difference.
Yeah, we wanted to. You know, Tommy, I'm sure is going, yeah, we wanted to. And the hard part is you know, we'd have to get cooperation from the data providers, because what we're using at the moment is what's available publicly, and if you go to the archive, you know, a couple of years ago, it's not there. So we'd have to go back to them, and then we'd have to get precise data on when things entered, and then we'd have to map it. So we started with what we thought was the easier question, looking at 1 year. Turned out to be much harder than we thought. As always, these things turn out to be hard. And so we haven't done it. It's a great question, Neil. It's a great dissertation for somebody. That's a bit of a punt. Actually, I think the other problem is right now we're in a boom market, by the way, right now. And it's been true for about the last couple of years. So it's very hard because demand is shifting, exactly as you're saying. So you have to be able to measure that directly to be able to see to have a hope of doing the dynamics properly. And that, I just think that's going to be hard. I mean, Tommy and I know we've talked to some of the people in the industry who negotiate these contracts, and, you know, he'll say, oh, you know, well, we're negotiating one up in Montreal today. Okay, why there now? Yeah, and that's what it will come down to when you have to do the dynamics. I think that's going to be pretty hard in practice. It's great topic though.
Okay, we have another question by Michael Watt. Going to unmute you.
Okay.
Hi,
Hey, it's nice to see all friends. You know,
Yeah.
we're all stuck at home and so on. It's all nice to see you. Everyone's still well. That's great.
Yeah, I was thinking about these private ones that you call them private. They're firms that are so big that they vertically integrated into this, and so their demand is greater than each one of these centers, and so that kind of tells you what the minimum efficient scale of a center is. And so, why would you have two instead of having one big one?
Yes, except that the ones who are integrating are also tailoring what they're doing to their unique technology. So yes, your economic intuition's right. So for like let's say Dropbox, right? Who's essentially doing core storage, but then when you go look at Facebook, actually they've modified the servers to meet their particular need, because they need a lot of virtual memory, and so they actually tailor what they're doing. And another one is Google. It's not just the data center; they're buying the lines too. Facebook does this too, by the way, right? So they have assured supply, and then they're apparently also investing in this distributed architecture. And don't ask me to explain it, because but apparently that's a big deal also.
That's two different changes from the Bresnahan then also, is that you have different scale of operations for each, and you have a differentiated product.
Yeah. But although, again, just to be clear, but not in the buildings. So what's so interesting is the size of the buildings apparently are limited by other things, not the land. It's just, they just don't want to make them any bigger. So even Facebook, that Prineville, Oregon site has 8 buildings there. They're all essentially the same size. That rather than taking the existing building and making them bigger, they replicate those buildings, which is interesting, right?
It tells you about scale too.
It tells you about scale, yeah.
Okay, we have one last question by David Nguyen. Going to unmute you.
Okay, thanks, Arnold. Shane, very fascinating work, very interesting. It's really cool to see we did some very initial things on the UK for some of these things on data centers and cloud computing services.
Yeah.
The price index side. I was wondering to what degree the entry decision of data centers might be related to kind of internet legacy infrastructure, so internet exchange points, cable landing points, these kind of things, because obviously that's quite hard to break in the long term as a thing. Thanks.
First of all, I know some of your work. It's great. Yeah, so it's nice to have you on the seminar. So anecdotally, we know it does matter. And then so your intuition is consistent with some stories, and then it's a challenge for us to try to document that in a systematic way across 1,000 counties. That's the challenge. So let me give you the story that's consistent with it. The Ashburn, Virginia is the largest collection of capacity in the United States. And May East is there. If you know the history of the internet, that's the first data exchange point for the NSF net. And the other one, of course, is in Santa Clara. Those were the two in the early NSF net. And that's where the data centers went, and they've collected around that point, and that's still a data exchange point. And that, highly suggestive that there's an agglomeration economics going on in that choice. They're already there, they're already exchanging data. And then they build more exchange. Of course, the problem is, we have one story and we don't know how to generalize it. And in talking with industry, it's been hard to generalize, because we know we're at least the 3 other data exchange points were for the NSF net, and none of the other 3 serve that function. It happens to be this one in Ashburn. On the other hand, it's consistent, but it's hard to generalize, and so the generalization is the hard part. So I'll leave 2 things with you on that story. One is, there's this simple story we tell about the TCP/IP as a way to distribute computing resources across geography so it can survive damage because the military wanted communications that could survive. Recognize that what's happened in Ashburn, Virginia, the private firms have really basically undone what the military wanted. They concentrated everything in one location. This is not a secret. At this point, I'm sure this is a well-known thing. So that's number one. Number two, and this is I don't know how to answer this. I would love to see someone get further into it. Private firms are opening data centers that serve as data exchange points. And some of the private firms in our data have found profitable ways to serve as centers for that exchange. And I'm pretty sure your intuition's right. We're pretty sure that they are locating in propitious places, right? In Dallas, or in Chicago, or in Denver, or in outside of Santa Clara. They're located in places where there's a lot of data exchange to take place, but they're serving this sort of quasi-public function at the same time, right? They're doing the interconnection for the internet, but they're also getting privately compensated enough to make it worth their private cost to do it. And I don't know how to think about those economics. I mean, somebody like Luis has to think about, smarter than me, can think about whether they're underinvesting or overinvesting relative to the social benefits. I mean, I have a hard time thinking about that in geographic space, but that's the interesting question. And you do see a lot of private investment to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shane. Guess we can conclude at this point. And thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting, and also to the audience for their comments and questions. And also happy to send you all the comments that I got. And before we wrap up, let me briefly advertise the next talk of the VIDA seminar in 2 weeks' time. On the 5th of November, we'll have Bo Kaugel from Columbia Business School giving a talk. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Those were great questions, and I really appreciate the time and attention. We really benefit from it. Happy to take more comments as well.